In many ways, they're Nintendo's most underrated development partners. They've been solidly working on Nintendo titles for over a decade across multiple franchises and have been trusted with some pretty big projects. They're also closely tied into the Zelda team, and the company has only been growing. We're going to look at some of Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma's comments, which could give us a bit of an insight into how Nintendo are thinking at this moment about Grezzo. One thing's for sure, something is cooking, and it's time to find out what. Welcome everyone to Nintendo Forecast, the channel for researched, measurable, accountable forecasts of the antics of the world's least predictable video game company. And today we're doing that deep dive into Grezzo. Who are they, and what exciting games are they likely to be working on? First up, a bit of background about the company. Grezzo was founded in 2006 by Koichi Ishii, a video game designer and developer who previously worked at Square Enix. Ishii is known for creating the Mana series, a series that needs no introduction. After leaving Square Enix, Ishii decided to start his own game development studio, and thus Grezzo was born. Initially, Grezzo worked on smaller projects and provided support for other game development studios. However, in 2011, they partnered with Nintendo to work on the 3DS title, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. This was a significant moment for Grezzo as it marked their first collaboration with Nintendo. The success of their partnership with Ocarina of Time led to more partnerships with Nintendo. Grezzo went on to work on more popular Nintendo franchises such as Majora's Mask and Luigi's Mansion. In fact, Grezzo has developed several remakes of classic Nintendo games, including the 2019 remake of Link's Awakening, one of my favourite games ever, and, in recent years, the remake of the popular life sim game Miitopia. And by the way, those 3DS porting skills may come in very, very handy for Grezzo as Nintendo looks to see how they can be deployed in the future. As time has gone on, Grezzo has continued to grow, expanding their team and capabilities. In 2018, the company was 62 people strong. By 2021, this had increased to 80. In 2022, it went up to 87 people, and they are continuing to hire. This isn't vast by the standards of some video game developers, and it's certainly true that the transition from primarily making 3DS titles to developing for Switch would have necessitated a larger development staff, if only to keep track with the more complex development of Switch games. However, in 2018, they were deep in development on the Zelda Link's Awakening remake, and polishing off a 3DS remake of Luigi's Mansion on the side. If the studio is a third bigger now than it is then, it gives you an idea of how its development capabilities could be growing as well. In recent months, they've looked to hire cinematic artists, character control engineers, and 3D CG map designers. They specify that it's for an action game with tastes medieval and stylish. Now, what does that suggest to you? Before we get into the obvious, let's do a quick hype check here, because there is a non-Zelda project that Grezzo have worked on which could also fit this description. Remember, Koichi Ishii has serious RPG development credit and developed the game Ever Oasis for 3DS. That game came out at the end of the lifespan of the 3DS, which in some ways felt a little bit like it had missed the boat, but in other respects may have been a smart move, launching a niche concept on a large install base. As committed as Grezzo have been to working on Nintendo properties, it's clear that these are highly creative people, and I think there is at least a low likelihood that we could see another original Grezzo IP or a development of the Ever Oasis franchise before the end of 2024. Nevertheless, the devs at Grezzo have been releasing Zelda games pretty consistently for well over a decade now, and I don't think it's any exaggeration to call them the Zelda team's most trusted partners. The Zelda team is pretty internal and don't have a huge number of partners they develop games with. Exceptions historically were the Capcom-developed 2D titles on Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, those were the Oracle games and Minish Cap, and their recent partnerships with Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja to develop the Warriors titles. They also let indie devs, Brace Yourself Games, play around with Crypt of the Necrodancer, Cadence of Hyrule, a lovely little title, but not one that was developed by the core Zelda team. However, in the last several years, it's all about Grezzo, both for Zelda remakes, and since the only title Grezzo have launched since the Link Awakening remake is that Miitopia port from the 3DS, it stands to reason that the promising team of trusted Zelda devs are circling in on completion of their next big project. What could it be? First of all, let's see what we can rule out. The Oracle's titles were long rumoured. It made perfect sense after Link's Awakening that the Oracle's games would also be remade. They were older titles for the Game Boy Color, and in many ways they were even less well known than Link's Awakening, which had already received a remake and was widely acclaimed as one of the best games of all time, and, to add a personal note, probably my favourite Zelda game up until Breath of the Wild. I actually thought that a remake of the Oracle games made quite a bit of sense to Nintendo, since the dual format release meant that they could double up on their profits in the late stage of the Switch's life. They also have a particular significance to current Zelda in the form of their director and writer, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, whose more recent credits include directing Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, as well, almost certainly, as Tears of the Kingdom. But if Fujibayashi feels a nostalgic tug on the heartstrings from these games, it's certainly not leading Nintendo to give them the Windfish treatment. There was always the question about the link to Capcom, and perhaps the involvement of the third party added a little more complexity that Nintendo really wanted to deal with in recreating these games, or perhaps they just decide that they don't need to recreate every game and that putting them on the virtual console equivalent of Nintendo Switch Online is more than sufficient. Irrespective, neither the Oracle games nor the other recent NSO debut, Minish Cap, are even remotely likely to come to the Switch as ports. A future system? Maybe. The Switch? I really don't see it. Nintendo has done some really strange things over the years, and I know Link's Awakening is available both on NSO Game Boy and as a remake, but the remake had 3.5 years grace before another version of the same game was offered up. That's not the case here. Another Zelda game with huge marquee appeal is, of course, A Link to the Past. This classic of the Super Nintendo era was an absolute barnstormer on SNES, and if it were on the Switch, just like Link's Awakening received rapturous applause, I imagine the joy at the return of A Link to the Past would be even greater. Look, I love Link's Awakening and I think it's an amazing game. It's a particularly nostalgic title for me since it was my very first Zelda game and one of the very first games I played from Nintendo at all. But let's face facts, A Link to the Past is a game with much broader popularity, name recognition, and therefore has a potentially higher sales ceiling. It's true that it has appeared in the SNES Online, but nearly 5 years have passed since then, so I think the option of a return is no longer off the table. Complicating matters is the existence of the 3DS sequel, A Link Between Worlds. A Link Between Worlds was never likely to appear on Switch while the 3DS continued to sell as a mainline system, but now that 3 years has passed since it was discontinued completely and games cannot be bought for it on the eShop, the option to bring over A Link Between Worlds might appeal to Nintendo as a good chance to use a major game of its back catalogue to bolster the Switch towards the end of its life, or to give it a new lease of life with a popular title of yesteryear. In fact, if you look back at the release schedules of Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess HD, and Skyward Sword HD, you'll see that they all came roughly 10 years after the original games, give or take a bit. And we're now approaching a very similar gap since A Link Between Worlds was released. Now, being 10 years on doesn't necessarily mean that The Link Between Worlds is definite to come over, but nevertheless it seems like the sort of game that could really bolster the Switch's appeal. Now, also, although I'm generally sceptical about double packs from Nintendo, the possibility of putting together both A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds into one game does seem particularly appealing and could offer a higher level of value than either game on its own. Think about it. Both of them use a pretty similar world, and so resources that develop one game could be used to develop the other as well. It could be a way of creating a really effective 2D Zelda revival without going to the extent of creating a whole new game from scratch. I do actually think A Link Between Worlds is reasonably likely in a 5-year window, and Grezzo's experience with ports to and from the 3DS may well put them in the catbird seat when it comes to shepherding the port. But this is not the same as a whole new title, and it seems difficult to imagine that Grezzo haven't been hard at work on a far more substantial project over the last 4 years. Remember, the gap since Link's Awakening released is getting on for 4 years' time. So before we drill down into those other tantalising possibilities, please take a moment to tap the like button to signal boost us to other Nintendo forecasters, and please share your opinion in the comments below so that we can benefit from as many different voices as possible in order, hopefully, to bring the wisdom of crowds to bear and make our forecasts even more precise. Okay, let's look at my favourite remake possibility. There have been various attempts to remake the original Zelda, and Eiji Aonuma once idly speculated about a remake of Zelda 2, but neither title seem especially ripe for a re-release on the strength of their name recognition and appeal alone. However, the one that really jazzes me would be Phantom Hourglass. Yes, it would need substantial reworking to divest it of the double screen only structure and make it work for the Nintendo Switch. It's almost impossible to imagine, even from Nintendo, that we'd see Phantom Hourglass before Wind Waker returns, but once that happens, all bets are off, and Phantom Hourglass's position as a direct sequel to one of the most beloved games of all time does give it a huge amount of potential. Grezzo did a great job at doing some really big changes around a well-established structure in Link's Awakening, and if they can reimagine Phantom Hourglass in the Wind Waker HD engine, I can see it bringing a lot more buzz to the title and giving Nintendo an even greener, evergreen title to put on the shelves. Of course, Grezzo does have one original Zelda game under its belt, the underappreciated multiplayer title Triforce Heroes. Aonuma often talks about multiplayer, and even in Breath of the Wild he mentioned wanting to include multiplayer elements. Strange then that it's such a long time since multiplayer Zelda has had its turn in the sun. Having said that, Nintendo Switch Online is soon reaching the stage where the next multiplayer Zeldas can hang out on the online service, and so a new retail multiplayer Zelda is really going to have to break down some pretty big barriers to make the kind of impact Nintendo would want from its franchise's next 2D iteration. However, Aonuma did, many years ago, promise an evolved style of 2D in an interview with Game Informer, shortly after Link's Awakening was revealed. Now, I ask you, is this truly an evolved style of 2D compared to, say, A Link Between Worlds? Of course, all the models are 3D, and there is some camera flexibility, and of course they've got that lovely new art style, but to all intents and purposes, this feels like a Switch version of the kind of thing we've already seen. But what if Aonuma was discussing ideas that have yet to bear fruit? I'm reminded of how incredibly awesome it was to watch Metroid Dread and see Samus Aran effortlessly switch from 2D to 3D as the camera swirled around her. A 2D game with huge 3D elements could be incredibly exciting and would certainly make 2D Zelda more of an event title than it might otherwise be. With the lags between mainline Zelda only getting longer, over 6 years for the last title, having another Zelda capable of generating even a fraction of the same hype would be very welcome. Although Triforce Heroes perhaps didn't work so well for them, this competent team with the support of the Zelda team could, I'm sure, develop a very interesting title. Indeed, the next console might benefit from an exclusive Zelda early in its run. So, let's get down to the forecasts. I think a Grezzo-developed Zelda releasing by the end of 2025 has to count as a high likelihood, 70% or thereabouts. There is always the possibility that they are developing their own project or projects for something else, and it could even be the case that the games they're working on are falling through. But the balance of probabilities has to land with Zelda coming out soon. We're already 4 years on from Link's Awakening, and even taking into account the pandemic, we should expect another Grezzo game, another major Grezzo game, about now. Beyond this, however, I can't say that any individual possibility seems more likely than another to me. A Link Between Worlds, A Link to the Past, Phantom Hourglass, a multiplayer title, or just a new 2D game with that evolved style of 2D, all seem completely realistic possibilities to me, and I can't find any particular measure to compare their likelihood. Therefore, at this stage, I'm rating each possibility as very low, around 10%, at least until new evidence comes to light. Of course, another major question is the future of Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD, and that's why if you click this link, you can watch a full video about how these two all-time classics could finally make their long-awaited return. Please check it out. I'll see you in the comments. Have a great day.